So now that they've all spoken, let me share with you the questions that I suggested to the panelists that might structure their comments. And I'll simply raise those for you to think about, and then we'll just open the floor to your questions and comments. The questions that I had posed for the panelists were first, whether there is or is not anything particularly distinctive about civil society in East Asia when compared to civil society in Western Europe or the United States. And if there is something distinctive about an East Asian civil society, where its origins might lie, if they lie in cultural commonalities or if they lie rather in an East Asian developmental state experience or somewhere else. I asked what they thought were some of the most important cultural and political differences among patterns of civil society in different countries of Asia, in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the PRC. What was their view of the relationship between civil society and democratization in East Asia? What was their view of the relationship between reform or revolution in East Asia and civil society? And finally, what was their thought about the relationship between nationalism and civil society in East Asia? And I think the panelists spoke in one way or another about these various questions, but there may well be other questions that members of the audience have in mind. So let me turn to you and open things up for your questions and comments, and then the reactions from the panelists. Daniel?
Yeah, I'm Daniel Koss. I'm a PhD student here at the government department. I was kind of waiting for the kind of transnational moment because everyone presented kind of country by country, and I was waiting for maybe how there's interaction between China or Japan, civil society, and I really didn't hear much about this and wanted to ask a little more. I mean, one thing that struck me is, Professor Kage, there was one photo where you showed an NGO demonstration, and the signs were written in English. And like, is this made to appeal to an international audience? Is this kind of anti-nationalist demonstration made for an international audience? And the other thing that struck me is, Professor Gao, you kind of talked about how NGOs, it's delegitimizing if you have kind of an international involvement. And then I was wondering about a wonderful program like SEED. Is that then problematic? Is it bad for legitimacy that you have international involvement in organizing NGOs in China from the government's perspective, or from ordinary Chinese people's perspective? Is it a problem that there's international involvement? I think it's a wonderful thing, but you said it's kind of problematic to have like foreign involvement in that. Yeah.
So let me turn to the panelists and ask for responses that you may want to make to Daniel's question about transnational or international connections among different civil society movements within East Asia, and then presumably outside of East Asia as well, with the kinds of things that Marshall was doing in both China and Japan. Would you like to say something first?
Yes, just on the question that you asked about the English language sign in the anti-nationalist movement, and I do think that there is something about anti-nationalist movements then that are conducive to English language signs, and I couldn't tell from the picture whether the signs were written in other foreign languages as well, but that also wouldn't be surprising, since I mean that's precisely what they're trying to advocate.
Would anyone else like to comment? Professor Gao?
Okay. Thank you for your question. And the government has its own policy and value, but the Chinese society just do what they can do or they want to do. And I published a paper and talk about the legitimacy of associations in China. And what I try to describe is the fact. And the organizations, associations can fund their resources and to gain their legitimacy to do many things different from the government, can accept. And just like the international engagement in philanthropy in China, just like in the case the lady mentioned. And there is a kind of regulation against foreign organizations took activities in China, but it has been happening all the years. And that's why I'm optimistic. I mean, the government, you can make your regulations, but the society can go its own way. It just this one is one thing. Another thing is refer to the East Asian civil society, and Kage mentioned the word nationalist civil society. I have the same opinion about the word in China. And if we talk about the civil society in the boundary, so we may more optimistic, so because the growth is very fast. But in the East Asian level, my judgment is very negative. And there are not many organizations to support the people for, just for the value, civility. And you should do the right thing. Even the people are foreigners. But in China, maybe in Japan, this kind of value is not visible. Pressure from the nationalism is too strong. And
so a worry about nationalism and the nationalist upsurge in China, and a feeling that it is in contradiction with the growth of civil society. Anyone else on this question? Yes. Jing-kai?
I'm Jing-kai, graduate student in the government department here. Question for Professor Kage and Professor Zhang. So on the variation between Korean and Japanese civil society, it seems that Korean civil society has taken an active role in electoral politics and political activity, national politics. Well, Professor Kage mentioned that Japanese civil society seems to be localizing, and it seems to me like failed to gain many national tractions in politics. They did not make many breakthrough in the anti-nuke social movements in recent Japanese politics. How would you explain the variation between Japanese civil society and Korean civil society? Does it have anything to do with the past dependent trajectory that civil society in Korean took an important role in democratization movement? Well, Professor Kage mentioned that Japanese democratization was more like a top-to-bottom process. A separate question for Professor Gao. When you mentioned that civil society become a taboo word in China, and the government has been taking some crackdown activities on some civil society groups like jailing of Xu Zhiyong and repression of Wang Gongquan. So I wonder, but you also mentioned the optimistic side that civil societies has been gaining some progress in China. So how would you identify, how does the Chinese government identify which kind of civil society groups are dangerous and we want to repress or crack down them? Which kind of civil societies are collaborative and we should nurture them and foster them? Thanks.
Please.
Thank you for the question. In discussing the difference in civil society by nation, I think that it is important to see, to examine the paths in which the transition to democracy was achieved in that society. And conventional wisdom is that Japan actually transitioned to democracy in Japan is kind of like imposed transition, which means like the democracy in Japan was achieved by external imposition by after the Pacific War. That's a conventional wisdom. So in that sense, I mean, the Japanese civil society did not play a big role in nation democratization. So Japan's civil society is understood as a very weak and acquiescent. That's a conventional wisdom. But the Professor Kage actually today, I mean, challenged this conventional view. So I agree with the Professor Kage's argument that Japanese civil society has played the big role in consolidating democracy. But I have a question for you. How do you evaluate the roles of the Japanese civil society in the transition to democracy? Are you still agree with the conventional wisdom? Or that's my question. Also, but in Korea, the transition to democracy in Korea is a mass-driven transition by the people. In Korea, the democracy is the trophy that was fought for and gained by the people, gained by the civil society groups. So because of that, Korea's civil society was understood as very strong, very rebellious, and that was fighting always against the governments, illegal governments, and like that.
And let me just ask a follow-up question to that. Within the Korean civil society movement pushing for democratization, which elements would you say were the most important politically? Was it the labor movement, the churches?
I would say, and broadly said, intellectuals and middle class. The intellectuals are consisting of students and those journalists. Actually, they initiated some kind of, and also they played an important role in organizing other sectors, civil society groups, the movements against the government.
Yes. On the question of explaining the difference between Korea and Japanese civil societies, not being an expert on Korean civil society, I think what I'll throw out is the distinction that Robert Pekkanen has made between American and Japanese civil societies, because I think the American model is perhaps somewhat more analogous to the Korean model in that it has very vibrant national level advocacy. And the hypothesis that Robert Pekkanen has put forth is that it's an institutional argument, and he argues that the American state gives much more generous tax breaks, for instance, to voluntary organizations, so that it's a lot easier for them to expand and to grow and to recruit large memberships and also to accumulate large budgets, because lobbying at the national level is really very expensive, and the way that the Japanese institutions are set up, it really impedes or it's not allow for the growth of organizations to the extent that the American state does, and I would imagine perhaps also with the Korean state as well. So that's but I would that's how I would respond to your question. In response to the question about how I would assess the role of civil society in Japan's transition to democracy, I think my response would be that democratization is not this 0-1, does it exist or does it not exist kind of thing. It's sort of, you can have partial democracies of degrees of various kinds, and I think I would argue that civil society did play a role in partial democratization, perhaps not in the full democratization. The rest, of course, was achieved by Americans, but in accomplishing partial democratization anyway, I think that civil society certainly did play a role.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you, whether the concept of civil society itself is useful for East Asian society. The first question, because civil society, you assume that you are fishy in the water called society. But in East Asia, probably people fish swimming not in the society, but they are swimming in the state. So I think this civil society and the state relation maybe is not very natural to East Asian society. My second reason to ask that question is that we are talking about two very different things with this concept of civil society. First, you are talking about political opposition. Opposition not in the royal sense, but opposition in the wild. But still they are talking about the state, about the government, the way how this state governs. The second, civil society is a social sector, which is nothing to do with politics. These are two different things, but we are talking at the same time, so I think it makes something confusing. So that's the reason I ask you whether civil society concept is useful for understanding East Asian society or state.
Who would like to tackle that one? Obviously, if we have centers for the study of civil society at Peking University, someone thinks the concept, or at least at one point in time, someone thought the concept of civil society was useful.
In the beginning, I wanted to talk about the civil society in East Asia, but I felt very bad about the material, and I had a story in China. There was a memorial wall of Japanese colonial farmers in Manchuria. Now the local government is Fangzhen Xian near Harbin, Heilongjiang provinces. Heilongjiang province, and other people in organized and know there is this kind of memorial wall, and they came from Shanghai to Heilongjiang and wanted to destroy the wall, and there was very strong criticism against the local government, and for me, it's a good thing, and even the enemy is human beings, and some people can have some way to remember the dead, right? But now the politics of the ceremony of the dead in China and in Japan has been a big political conflict, and I think in this way, it's not civil. The civility is not, presented or visible, and the opposite value and feelings, hatred, and like this appeared, and if it's suitable to use in regional, across or transnational, I think it's suitable. Just we only until now we have more positive, negative thing, and in this situation you already used the measure, right? The rule to talk about it. It's productive, and it can you can find something. You can find something we should do in the future. So it's good. The concept is productive for knowledge, right?
And I think, I've had this debate with Professor Gao in the past, and he's pointed out to me that it's not simply a question of objectively analyzing what there is in East Asia. If you believe in certain civic values, as he's pointing out, then you want to make those civic values happen. And one way to do that is to start talking about civil society, even if in fact it might objectively, by scholars looking at it from outside China, look like it's something quite different from the civil societies with which they're familiar. But if you want to move in the direction of those other civil societies, then you start talking about it, and you start building centers that are named centers for civil society, and you start mobilizing people, or at least organizing people around those kinds of concepts, and that can have a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy itself. But of course, what civil society means is a highly contentious issue, not only if we're trying to apply it to East Asia, but in the way in which it's been used in the United States, in different European countries, at different points in history, and so forth. I think Professor Gao is very clear that for him it has a value of civility, and trying to promote those values, and seeing the contradiction between those values and the nationalism that is sometimes embraced by intermediate associations is for him, I think, a deeply concerning issue. Would others want to comment on the utility of using the idea of civil society for analyzing East Asia?
I think that I know the reason why you are asking this question. Actually, in the previous discussions, much attention is paid to the East Asian civil society's limited autonomy from the state. So I think that it is essential to define the concept of the state. Most of the difficulties in applying civil society concept to East Asian context seems to come from the differences in the concept of the state in Western sense and that in East Asian context. It seems to me that most of, the state in most Western contexts, in many cases, is relatively more open, sort of as something equivalent to power machinery, government organization. But in East Asia, actually, as you mentioned, the state actually must be understood both as a political machinery and at the same time as a cultural idea, which means like it's covering entire community, in the sense that people actually the language of the state has been used and reflected in everyday life of the common people. So in this sense, in East Asia, society was subsumed under this concept of the state as a cultural idea, which people internalized. Even the people internalized the power of the states. So that's very confusing. I think that. So in order to answer to your question, I think that we need to think about how to define the state concept in East Asian context. So that's the only answer I can give.
Final question before we break for reception, Joe?
How you relate the concept of civil society and the concept of community. I live out in the burbs, and so when you have young kids, as I once did, you become a soccer coach, you even become a baseball coach, but there's a tremendous amount of that sort of community activity that goes on at that level, including, of course, churches and town meeting and all those sorts of things that make New England what it is. And it seems to me that if you think about American civil society, as contested as that concept may be, that a lot of the way we approach it grows out of the communities that we live in and the values that we get and our sense of organization there. And it seems to me that that builds the capacity that Marshall referred to that continues these sorts of things. And one of the things that when I go to China I don't see is that sort of community. There are no Little League organizations in China that I know of. Parents don't get together and take their kids out. It's all organized by the schools or the state at some level. And it seems to me that that's part of the weakness of civil society in China. And I was just wondering how these two concepts, which we tend to separate, are related. And I'd be interested in Marshall's reflections or anybody's, whatever.
Marshall, would you like to? respond?
Yeah, I think I'd really be interested to hear about the perspective on China from Dr. Gao. My impression is that temple associations, temple societies actually have significant local rootedness and capacity, and that it's not quite as in this country, strong in some. New England, of course, is the crucible of American, at least one understanding of American civil society. There's lots of parts of this country where communities, in that sense, are devastated through poverty, through racial division, and so forth. So, I mean, I think it's important to have a clear-eyed view on, on any of these kinds of comparisons. But I think these words are slippery. Community. When we talk about community organizing, we think about transforming a community into a constituency. In other words, giving it an organized form. We know in the U.S. Since the beginning how significant the associationism that de Tocqueville writes about was important given his fears about individualism. And so the idea of association being a place where people could learn, develop common understanding, and so forth. And of course, in most New England townships around here, they have a commons, they have a church, they have a meeting house, and so forth. That was part of that tradition. So I don't know. I think these are terms of I think we have to define how we're using them when we use them. But I do think that in the American context, community level organization has always been pretty important. But the pattern has also often been, as Theda Skocpol's work has shown and others, a linkage of local to state to national. It's never been just sort of this isolated individual community, except for more elite organizations. So it's been as much a mechanism of integration as of local engagement. Not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but. Well, what's happening here right now in this country is the hollowing out of that civic structure. And that's this move to mobilization as opposed to organization, so that the majority, 85% of the people, can want gun legislation in the Congress, but because the NRA has 13,000 local groups, they're able to carry the day politically. And so I think here it's a very contested question right now of what direction we're moving in terms of how we're constructing what we would call civil society.
We haven't talked at all about virtual civil societies.
Oh, that's another.
The role of the internet in this and what it does for either fostering or destroying a sense of local community.
It's really, just to comment, there was a very interesting piece by, she teaches she was interviewed on Chris Hayes the other night, teaches at University of North Carolina, studies the mobilization and organization over the internet. She's a scholar from Turkey, and her name is escaping me right now, but I don't know if anybody's seen that paper. Yeah, she did an op-ed. Yeah, she had an op-ed in the New. Yeah, it was very, very. It's very interesting because the social media offer a very low-cost way of mobilizing, and that has enormous advantages. I mean, I do a distance learning class in 20 countries with people because we can see each other real time. It's great. A lot of low-cost advantages. On the other hand, it means you can mobilize without building infrastructure. And in the old days, you had to build an infrastructure in order to be able to mobilize. So then you wind up mobilizing, but then the folks with the infrastructure are the ones that collect. And so we're just learning about this stuff. I think what's so exciting is that there's just enormous experimentation about what's virtual, what's not, how you connect over distance or not. And I just think there's a lot of learning going on about that right now. But it's a crucial area of learning.
Let me ask each of the other panelists what final comments they might like to make. Professor Gao?
I will try to respond to your question. And there are two levels of community. One is the concrete place. Another is the general, abstract, or imagined community. And I think if you have this kind of belief, the society of the people in the society always organized themselves in some ways. And as for China, there were many kind of local community organizations, traditionally the lineage organizations, and now very popular the religious organizations, the traditional religion or Buddhism or even Christianity, and there are so many. And this one side, another side. Even in America, I just bought a book by I don't remember his name. He just moved from Chicago Department of Sociology, Chicago, to Harvard, and the title of the book is "The Great American Community or City," the Great American City, and he described how the community works, even in Chicago, in the big city. It's a very interesting way to find the real, the reality, much different from Putnam's opinion in bowling along. And so it depends your categories to identify the society. And even in China, there are many community organizations.
I might add that Professor Gao is a student not only of civil society in China, but also civil society in America. Actually, during his year at the Harvard-Yenching Institute, he spent it not here in Cambridge, but in Muncie, Indiana, because that's where the study Middletown, USA was done. And he went back there to restudy American civil society today using the archives of many sociologists over the years who have restudied that town. And many of Professor Gao's students are in little towns all over America studying American civil society. So he is someone of truly comparative interest. Professor Jung?
Very interesting. Yeah.
Would you like to make some final
Actually, as I mentioned, Korea has a very strong the civil society tradition. So based on this past experience, actually recently there's some Korean scholars arguing for the civil consensus, replacing Washington and Beijing consensus, in the sense that these are top-down consensus, while the civil consensus based upon the bottom-up approach for the society development. So this reflects like strong civil society tradition in Korea. Okay, that's my final question.
Yes, I also just like to quickly address the question of community and civil society. And Japan's civil society, as I alluded to earlier, is quite locally based, and so the communities and civil society very often overlap. And most households even today are members of neighborhood associations, and they take care of a lot of communal tasks at the community level. But in contrast to the U.S., what is interesting, I think, is that the very strong local foundations don't necessarily sort of add up to strength at the national level, and the Robert Pekkanen work would suggest that even when you have those very strong local foundations, you need other additional institutions for the national level strength to really come into force. So.
Well, thank you very much to our four panelists for very different, but I think all in their own ways very stimulating presentations and responses, and thanks to all of you for your questions. I think we have a simple reception outside, so if some of you would like to stay on a little bit longer and ask our panelists some follow-up questions, you're very welcome to do that. But thank you very much for attending.